Hi, I'm Ollie Bowen. I'm co-director of the Interactive Media Lab at UNSW Art and Design. This is the first in a three-part stream which introduces interaction design and looks at methods, theories and practice, developing an interactive design practice that you can take into the workforce. We're going to focus initially in this course on what is probably the most traditional and recognizable aspect of interaction design, which is centered around the screen and screen-based interaction, either on a computer, in browsers or on a phone. Let's start with a scenario, simple scenario. You're on the train and you're speaking to a friend on the phone and you're going over Sydney Harbour Bridge and you look out and there's a beautiful sunset and you decide you want to take a photograph of that sunset and you're going to use your phone to do that. So you ask your friend, hold the line, I'm just about to take a photo, give me a second, and you switch apps. You go to the camera app, you take your photo and you do that and save the photo, go back to speaking to your friend, you hang up and later on you post that photo on Instagram. So if you think about that interaction scenario, it's something we've all done something similar to that presumably, and you'll be fairly familiar with what's involved in that if you've ever used a smartphone. What makes that a good experience for the user? What makes it possible for them to achieve what they wanted to do, makes them happy? What kind of problems might have come up? What we've just described there is a user scenario. It's an imaginary one in this case, I just made it up, but it's one that's grounded in real lived experience. Obviously one of the things that's going to make that kind of experience possible is the technology that we have. So we now have devices in our pockets that enable us to make phone calls, but also to take photographs and to do different computing activities on a small handheld device. So the power of the technology is pretty key to enabling that form of interaction. But there's a whole range of design aspects that have made that kind of ease of use possible. So the very fact that you are aware that you could do that you could pull the phone out of your pocket or switch from a call to a camera shot and then back to a call again, all without breaking the flow of your activity, is because of the design that grounds that. So we're going to think about that kind of interaction scenario, and we're going to spend a lot of time in this course developing user scenarios. We might do that in our imaginations, make things up and then kind of step through what might happen in those cases, or we might engage in observation. We might go and look at people using smartphones in different contexts and with different purposes in mind, or we might do something a little bit in the middle. We might prototype ideas where we take a concept and we test that with a group of users, maybe in a lab environment, maybe just using rough prototypes, things that don't actually work but that help us understand interaction. Okay, so we're going to go back to this scenario a few times. The first thing I want to think about is a distinction that's quite key in interaction design between two ways of thinking about successful interaction. And one of those is usability, and that's the idea that basically we're making something that a person can use, things don't go wrong, they don't break, they don't cause frustration, they don't fail and result in some task not being achieved. And then closely related to that is something that we call user experience, and that's much broader. In some ways it incorporates usability, and that's about how someone feels, how the task that or the device or the service that they're interacting with engages them, makes them feel good or makes them feel a certain way. Those two things are very closely related. So obviously if something works, it makes you feel good, and if something makes you feel good, then you're more likely to want to engage with it and understand how it works. So usability and user experience are two different categories. We can look a bit more in depth at usability. So we talk about having a user scenario. And in our case, that involved someone being on the phone and they're having a phone call, and that's continuing over time, but at some point they decide that they're going to take a photo with the camera, and then they're going to go back to the phone call, continue on, hang up, upload their photo and so on. So we've got some kind of user interaction process taking place here, and that's under the category of a user scenario. Over here, let's think about usability and user experience as two different ways of thinking about that activity. So usability is about whether something works, how it works, what task is achievable. User experience is about how something feels. Okay, so usability is about things like ability, knowledge, goals. So you've got something you're trying to do. We want to understand how easy it is to do that, what knowledge is required to achieve that, and so on, how that technology is going to support you in that task. So user experience is more to do with things like emotion, feeling, and how you associate with a certain experience, a certain product, a certain activity. So these are, it's very important to recognize that they're not neatly separated, but they're two different ways of thinking about how this user scenario is taking place. So we can think about a task here. We can think about the person setting out to achieve this task and what it is that's required for them to be able to do that. Take a photo whilst on the phone. We can think about that in terms of goals, and then we can start to look at the knowledge required and the interface that's required to make that possible. But we can also think more broadly about we can actually step outside of the whole realm of goals, and we can think about the fact that they even decided to engage in that kind of activity. So they might be someone who likes to post photos a lot, and so they want to be very spontaneous, and they associate that phone and its abilities with those kinds of spontaneous experiences and so on. So that gives us a couple of other things to think about in terms of how we frame this scenario. So one thing is exactly that, the question of how goal-focused we're thinking. So when we design things, we're generally designing things that have a purpose that we can identify, and we've got a fairly good understanding of when we've achieved that in terms of someone can actually complete a task. So let's think of a piece of software like Microsoft Word, and someone wants to write a letter, and we can set them the task of writing the letter, and they can go through that process, and we can measure how well they did that, how quickly it took them, and what kind of errors came up along the way. But whenever we design software or whenever we design experiences, we're also opening up new worlds of possibility, and that's really essential to the designer. The designer doesn't have to be a slave to a whole load of user expectations. They can create spaces of possibilities. And quite clearly, something like the advent of the smartphone opened up this world. So companies like Apple and Google created platforms upon which other people developed applications that run. They didn't have every application and every use case in mind when they developed the phone, but they were very aware of the fact that they were creating these spaces of possibility. So when we go back to the user scenario, one of the things we really need to think about is this scenario happening in the wild, the spontaneity with which someone decided to undertake that activity of taking the photo whilst on the phone, and what context was required for that to come about. So 15 years ago, we simply didn't have that kind of technology where everything was all in the one place. We did have camera phones, but they generally weren't powerful enough and capable enough for us to be doing this kind of simultaneous task. Now it's very common, and yet you would need to have seen someone do that, or need to have learnt how to operate the phone in order to be able to switch apps and so on. So there's a framing of that use case. The user needed to know some stuff. Okay, so that's one aspect. But if we go back into a bit more detail about usability, let's just think about what, particularly this question of knowledge, and also a little bit about ability. So when we analyze a user scenario, one of the things we're most interested in looking out for is what the user has in their head, what they understand about that interaction scenario. So in the case of the phone camera situation, obviously one of the things that we would be looking out for is you've switched out of being just solely in a phone call, and you're now in a multi-application situation where you want to take that photo, But the phone needs to be telling you things like you're still on the phone, you're still in a call. So you've got a red, generally you'd have some kind of red hang up sign or something that's hovering over, that's making sure that you're aware of that. One of the things that can go wrong is that you're not aware that you're still in a phone call and you think the call's ended, and so you have a mistaken understanding of the state of the device. So what the user knows is really important under all of these interaction scenarios, and what they know they can do next is also really important. So they need to know what state the phone is in, that it's still in the middle of a phone call, but they also need to be presented with options. If someone had never done this before, but they'd seen someone else do it, they knew it was possible, then they'd be looking for clues, like how do I switch apps and so on. And of course, we're very familiar with these kinds of operating systems now, but they are carefully designed so that those clues are there in the system. So when we set up a user scenario, we want to know as much as we can about what the user knows. And one of the things that is very important to do, therefore, is to really have a good understanding of who the user is. So one of the main things we do when we're designing imaginary user scenarios is we're trying to actually build an imaginary persona of the user that we're interested in, because not everyone's the same. For example, if you imagine this user scenario, just to continue this example, think of different people in different situations. Imagine someone's carrying a baby, they've only got one hand, and that might affect how easily they can do that task. Is someone particularly pro-technology and very keen to explore and understand how things work, or are they very scared of technology and they want things to be made easy? So we paint a picture of the user, and that's generally known as developing a persona. And a typical thing to do when you're kind of doing your initial stage interaction design is to create personas by actually writing out some descriptive detail about that person, what their age is, give them a name, make it as real as possible, say what job they do, describe some of their personality traits. Are they very pro-tech? Do they like sport? Whatever it may be, just so that you can then really use that imaginary person to develop the idea. So we could do that with this scenario. So we've built a model of the user, or maybe we have users available to study, and we want to understand what they know and what they can do. One way that we frame that is with some of the toolkit of concepts that come from originated by Don Norman in his book, The Psychology of Everyday Things. And this is a very general background set of tools for thinking about interaction. It applies to all kinds of objects, but it's particularly relevant in interaction design. So one of the key ideas is the idea of affordances. And that actually comes from biology and looking at ecology and looking at how different species interact. But it's been applied in the area of design. And the basic idea of an affordance is it's something that, a potential interaction between two things. So the classic example that's always used is that a door handle affords pulling. So if you imagine going up to a door and there's no handle, maybe it's a push door, the door affords pushing and you can go through that door. If it's a door that is only pullable but there's no handle, then there's no affordance to pull the door open. So that's probably the most classic example. And just to elaborate on that a little bit, if you, the point there is to kind of have quite a radical framing of what interaction possibilities are there. So if you think about a door compared to a wall, a door affords opening, but a wall doesn't afford opening. It's not an obvious thing to say, but that's why affordances helps you frame and think through the design aspects or the possibilities or the interaction possibilities of any particular design. Now, affordances are the things that we can do with a thing, but we may or may not know that those things are possible. So an object affords picking up. That's the affordance is inherent in the object, and the fact that we can see that it affords picking up is just mostly a product of physics and our understanding of physics. We can see that the object is not attached to something and that it's not too large and we can pick it up. So many natural things in the world generally have perceived affordances, but they also have many hidden affordances. So good design, one way of thinking about affordances in design is to think about how perceivable the affordances or how visible the affordances are. And in general, we talk about the visibility of the system. So are all of the things that can be done visible? That's particularly important in digital systems. Why? Mainly because the entire functionality of the system almost is hidden in invisible software. So we need to work very hard to make those affordances visible. So we'll put up perceived affordances here as a related thing. So if you think about anything on a screen, like a button, that's a physical button, but on a screen we would have something that may not even look like a button. We step away from that skeuomorphic physical representation because we're so familiar with things, perhaps a bit of hypertext that is simply marked by its underlining, and the underlining is all that you need nowadays in a contemporary world where people know about hyperlinks. The underlining is all you need to communicate that affordance that you can click on the link. So this idea of the relationship between affordances and perceived affordances is very important. So another one of Norman's concepts is constraints, which is very closely related to affordances. It's kind of the opposite of affordances. It's the things that are not available to you, that are limited, that are hidden away from you. Take an example, in a modern automatic car, sometimes you can't turn off the ignition and take the key out of the car until you've put the car in park mode. And that's a designed constraint. It's something that physically can't be done. The designers have made it impossible for you to do that. And that's for a safety reason. So designers are constantly imposing constraints on the range of things that you could possibly do. So we can think about different ways. Sometimes constraints are physical. Sometimes they're slightly more virtual. It might just be a warning or something like that. And we can even talk about cultural constraints. So things that you could do, but you wouldn't be inclined to because of something cultural or social. Another theme is mapping. All of these in some way relate to basically intuitive interaction. Okay, so if you had lots of time and a massive manual, you could read the manual and learn how to use something. But what we're trying to do in design as much as possible is make that use intuitive so that you can pretty much get rid of the manual, or even if you did have to read the manual, at least the design of the interface would be supporting your intuitive understanding. We could think about mapping in the classic example that Norman gives of, you may have this at home, here's an oven, or here's the gas hobs that you cook on, looking down from above, and on the front of the oven you've got 4 dials. And this is quite a common way to lay out those dials. So there is potentially a missed opportunity here in terms of how the mapping has been done. Which of these knobs controls which element? Well, we can guess that the left and the right ones, these two are on the left and these two are on the right, but we're not quite sure which one controls the back and which one controls the front. There's no obvious mapping. We could slightly redesign this in any number of ways. So we could maybe do this, and that would give you a slightly better indication of which hob was controlled by which knob. Or some designs would add the controls here, and again that gives you a slightly better mapping. So there's lots of ways we can do that in digital interfaces that would make the interaction more intuitive, and we can think of that in any number of ways, from the layout of text on a page, just to place things, order things in natural related ways, or the use of sliders or things that control data. So this course is going to focus quite a lot on graphical user interface design. We've had desktop computers in our homes and in our offices for several decades now. everyone doing this course has been brought up understanding how to use a desktop, but let's just break down some of the basics there. The core paradigm of the graphical user interface for a desktop computer is called the WIMP paradigm, and that stands for Windows, icons, menus, and pointer. So your user interface, your operating system is based on these, they're organized according to these principles. So you have a window, which is a space in which an application runs. So there's certain things we know about a window. For example, we know that it's attached to a certain application. An application might have multiple windows, but a window wouldn't typically have multiple applications. Icons are things on desktops or buttons on screens. They're basically buttons. They're interface elements that allow us to cause actions to occur. Menus provide another way to access a range of actions, and generally we think of pop-up menus that come from the top of the screen on a Mac or the bottom of the screen on Windows, and that list possibilities. We also think of contextual menus, which are menus that we can make pop up on specific elements, which are a core idea. So being able to choose something and perform some kind of action on that thing is a major aspect of interaction design on a desktop or on a phone, and that's one way that we do that. And really fundamental is the idea on a desktop environment of having a pointer. So the paradigm of interaction there is using a mouse or a trackpad, possibly using touch-based interaction, but the idea is you're moving a pointer around the screen and clicking on things. So that frames the way that we've set up using computers for many decades. There are other forms of interaction and interface design within computer systems. For example, we can have entirely command line based interaction. So think of a Unix terminal where you type commands. That's the older pre-WIMP form of interaction and is still used in many situations. Now, if we think about the way that a smartphone works, a touch screen, this is very different because it doesn't have a pointer, okay? So no pointer. Instead, we've got multiple fingers that make contact with the screen, but there is no hover state. So when we're working on a desktop computer, the mouse is always there, the pointer is always there somewhere hovering around, even if we're not touching or moving the mouse. On a touch screen, the mouse is not, or the pointer is not always there, and that creates a slightly different form of interaction. For example, we don't have the mouse over effect where we're hovering over something and that can cause extra information to appear and so on. And likewise, this is typically a multi-touch environment, which means that you can have 2 points of contact, and that can either cause two things to happen, or it can cause some meta gestural interface to happen. So there's slightly more complex forms of interaction here. So if we take those concepts that we just looked at, affordance, constraints, perceived affordance constraints, and mappings, and we can start to look at the design of these kinds of basic operating system level interfaces and all of the widgets involved in designing interaction in these contexts, and we can think about them in terms of their affordances and their mappings. So, for example, contextual menus are incredibly powerful at producing a specific action on a specific element as and when you need it, which is harder to do from top-level menus where you may not have the focus on the specific element. So these are the core elements that you're working with when you're designing interaction on a screen. But something essential to understand about this course is that we're never strictly focused on what interaction is happening between you and the screen. That's an interface onto a computational system which might be networked, cloud-based, and might have other physical interaction components. So take, for example, the situation where you're loading up a sat-nav application, navigation application on your phone to run whilst driving your car. That involves GPS, so it involves location services on your phone. It involves communicating with the cloud to receive navigation information. It involves knowing which direction the car's going in, and a range of other potential interaction scenarios that expand beyond just the screen. There might also be sound alerting you to things going on. So we always take a holistic approach because any design situation will involve different types of network interaction, different types of input and output. And there's another scenario where certain design limitations are going to be very important. So when you're driving your car, you can't really be touching the screen. You want things to be very clear. It's the kind of situation where there's a safety concern and the design has to take that into account. Okay, so let's go back to that scenario that we talked about earlier and think about some of the scenarios that you can investigate yourself in your own time. That's the first thing we want to do in this course. Before you come in week one, then you should go through the steps of observing some digital interaction and doing this in the form that an interaction designer might do, which is known as an ethnographic bit of research, where you're basically going out, looking at interaction in the wild, and making your own observations about how that's working. So what I want you to do is think about some kind of contemporary, recent app-based experience. So Uber, Deliveroo, Uber Eats, or using Google Maps to get around, or the Opal app, and so on. So any kind of experience that is a recent invention. I want you to get somebody else to participate in a task such as booking a ride on Uber, ordering something online to eat, or navigating their way through the city. And you're going to observe them and you're going to follow them while they do that task. You're not going to tell them what to do except to set the task in the first place. And that can be something that they're naturally going to be doing anyway. So maybe your parents or your friends are ordering food and you can observe them doing that. And I want you to focus on looking at all of the things that they need to do in that interaction. And one of the methods we use to study and understand what someone's doing is we just ask them to speak aloud. So they're actually going to be telling you, they're going to be talking aloud while they're doing that task, and they're going to be saying what they're trying to do next, what they do understand, what they don't understand about the system, so that we can really witness them in action. And you could also maybe video that or record it or make notes, and then you can go back through that later and ask them to clarify and get an understanding of what they could and couldn't do. This might go very smoothly, or something might go wrong, and you can look a bit further into what went wrong and why. But then I want you to take that a step further and try and come up with scenarios that really challenge the capability of that system. So it might be that you are trying to take an Uber that goes to 5 different locations, or maybe a situation where your phone battery runs out halfway through the transaction, and so on. So find those situations where there's a challenge and a breakdown in that scenario, and bring that into your area of research. And what we're going to do is you don't have to do any analysis of that, but we're going to discuss those in class. So everyone should bring into class one of these examples. Take all of the concepts that we've discussed so far, the ideas of affordances, constraints, mappings, user scenarios, usability and user experience, and start to map out what kinds of things are happening in that interaction. And we'll discuss that in class. As a second brief exercise that you can do out there in the wild is to think about personas, and just as a simple study, think about how people approach cables. So we all have cables coming out of our laptops for charging our phones, for plugging in the heater. Look at, say, 3 different households or work environments, or 3 different contexts that you can find, and look at how the people in each of those contexts deal with cables. Are the cables messy and strung out all over the floor? Are they very neatly tied away? Will someone have extension leads to hand if they need to move something from one side of the room to the other, or will they make do and plug things over wherever they need to be plugged in? This just gives you a framework for thinking about personas, because cables are a part of our lives, and they have a quite a big impact on how we might interact with devices. So try and find different ways that people do those and categorize those and think about how those influence potential design considerations.